All right, we'll get underway. There may be a couple of just going to tiptoe in and join us as we get going. So this is the fifth of a six-part series. So the idea is that, particularly for those of you that are preparing to be confirmed, but also others that have just maybe been away from church a long time and they're trying to get a sense of, so what do they really believe down at that cathedral or whatever. So we put it together in a way that it was a kind of an introduction to church membership, faith. And because we've been recording the sessions, as you guys have found out, you can catch up a bit by watching some of them, and you can send me your list of tricky questions later from those first couple of sessions. So what we've been doing, we started out looking at Anglicanism. What is this Anglican thing, Anglican church? We looked at Jesus and our relationship with him as disciples. We had a session on the Bible. Last time around, Ros Rogers did a thing on prayer and spirituality. Today we're going to talk about mission, the mission of the church, and then we wrap it up next week by looking at intentional discipleship. And then that'll be the end of that particular series. And then we've got a couple of big Sundays with lots of things happening. The 18th is the first communion class from the school, and the year 4 coming to church that day. And then the following Sunday is Christ the King. And the confirmation will probably be some other time just because of how calendars have worked out. So, mission. So, some years ago now, quite a few years ago, the International Anglican Organisation, the Anglican Communion Office, came up with what they call the 5 marks of mission. And it's a helpful way for us to think about what's the point of the church? What's it about? Are we selling fire insurance, or what is it that the church is doing? And of course, it's all this stuff, and we're not going to work through all of those, but these are the kind of key words that come to mind when we think about the mission or the role of the church. And of course, as you know, with word clouds, the bigger the word, then the more significant it is within the cloud. So obviously we're on about God. We're about changing people, renewing people, teaching, telling, sharing, and so on. And I want to unpack that rather than just go through the list of words. So I want to start with what we mean by mission, because for a lot of people, particularly Anglicans, we used to do missions. We used to collect money in little paper boxes, cardboard boxes, give it to missions. And by that we meant basically white people taking the news about Jesus to brown people somewhere in the tropics. That was more or less what mission meant. It meant a kind of process of evangelizing and sharing the faith and growing the church in other places. But it's a much broader idea, but a simpler idea at the same time. A word like lots of English words, which either come from Latin, Greek, or French. This one comes from Latin, and the key Latin words are mater and miss. And we use this in lots of ways to do with the life of the church, but we also have it in the word missile, and that reminds us of a key point. The core idea of these things is that you're sending something, you're throwing it or you're sending it. And so when we talk about the mission of the church, it's not just, it's the idea that God has sent us to do something. But it's both, not just sent, like go away, but it's go and do something. That's the idea of mission. So, and we still use it that way. We'll talk about the Australian mission in Beijing, and by that we mean the Australian diplomatic representation who've been sent to Beijing, and they have a job, which is to represent Australia and to spy a little bit without getting caught and bring the information back and so on. So they've got a job. They've been sent on a mission. And famously, at the end of the Iraq War, remember, then President Bush went on an aircraft carrier, all dressed up like a real soldier, and said, "Mission accomplished." And the fighting went on, and people are still dying. But that idea that there was a mission, people have been sent. So when we bring this down to think about us as Christians, then we're talking about the idea of Christians are people who are sent with a job, with a mission, with something to do. Come on in, we'll grab a couple of extra chairs and just kind of fit people in. You all right?
Yeah.
That's right. Got to look after Derek because he's probably bringing a tray of coffee. Okay, so we're just unpacking this word mission. It comes from the same Latin root as the word missile, but also it's in English use. It's about sending people to get something done or to achieve an outcome. So that's what I want us to do a little bit of thinking about this morning. Because it's not so much the mission of the church is perhaps interesting. What really matters is what's God trying to achieve, and do we even think that God is trying to achieve anything? Okay, to unpack that a little bit. So when we talk in the church, as we do these days, about God's mission and the church is involved, it's not that the church has a mission, but the church's mission is to do God's work in the world, and God's work will be broader than the church, presumably. But we have a bit to contribute to what God is doing. Of course, there are people who say, no, God is only found inside the Christian church or only in this little bit of the Christian church. But most people say, no, God's at work everywhere. But we have something to do as part of what God is doing. So the idea, if we believe in a God who sends us to get something done, not simply a God who's static and it's all about the past. Okay, so it's got to be about there's some sort of target, some sort of goal that God's working on. So we've got a God who's involved in mission, a God who didn't just kind of hang up his boots on sort of Friday afternoon and say, that's it, I've done my 6 days of work, I'm finished, I can have the rest of forever off. Okay? Because if to say it that way, we know that's odd. So we're saying God is continuing in some way to be involved in making everything happen that happens. Now, unpacking that's the tricky bit. But it's a big difference between saying a God who's started it all and then disappeared, has no more involvement, or a God who is continually involved. And one of the interesting ideas in modern theology is what's called process theology, that God is involved in the process. And indeed, God is the process. That as the world comes to be, that is God. And one of the really interesting thinkers a few years ago now, a couple of decades ago now, but she was particularly writing, she tried to get people to think about the world, the earth, and the universe as God's body. Okay, because God is so intricately, this is how God has expressed God's self by creating the universe. So that gives us a bit of an idea of what God's mission is about. So it's an idea I wanted to unpack a little bit, not because we're going to get it answered, but because I think it's really critical to moving from a kind of a understanding of religion where God is kind of our house elf, to use a Harry Potter type language. You know? Hey God, I want this today. God, I don't like this cancer, or God, I don't like whatever. Of course we don't like the cancer. But to shift to the idea of, oh, hi God, now what are you wanting from me? Which is a rather different kind of orientation, makes a difference in the world. So, some questions. Do we have any ideas about what we think God is trying to achieve? This is where you can speak up and give me some suggestions. If you were God, what would you be trying to do? And since you're not God, I think, we're in trouble if you are, what do you think God is? In a sense, when we say what is God trying to achieve, another way of saying that is, what's the point of being alive? What's life's about? Yeah. Sorry? Happiness, for sure. God doesn't want people to be depressed and demoralised and stressed to our eyeballs. You know, stress is there for when we need it. Something bad happens, you need to react straight away. But you can't live wound up like that. On high alert 24/7, or else we go big.
I don't think God probably wants us to help other people. As well as look after ourselves, help other people.
Yep. So it's not about me.
Me, egocentric.
It's about us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So church, if understood properly, faith is the ultimate community focus thing. It's about community. It's not about me getting myself to heaven or me getting myself out of hell. It's about all of us together. Okay. We've got some other questions there. What were they? Oh yeah. Okay. So if we start to get an idea of what we think God is trying to achieve, and I'll suggest some pathways about that in a moment. Then the next question becomes, well, if this is what God is wanting people to, so if this is what God's trying to do, even if it's promote well-being, happiness, connectedness, community, breaking down isolation and loneliness and so on, that we are in this world together, and the world is, we can see from the way the world is structured, it's a highly connected, integrated, dynamic system. For each bit to work, all the bits have to be working. There's a system about the way the universe is structured. If that's what God is about, then one of the questions then becomes, so what is the church's bit in that? So, for instance, the role of the church is not to keep the church going. Or the reason for coming to church on Sunday is not to keep the Anglican brand going. Now, I hope it does. I think it's got something good to offer the city. But it's actually something bigger than that. I mean, if we need to be asked the question, what is God trying to achieve in Grafton? How does God want to bless Grafton? And what would Grafton look like if it was really living the blessing that God intends for everybody? And what things would we get rid of or would we solve in order for that to be the case? These are the questions where the second one comes in. Well, maybe they're the things the church has to focus on, rather than just doing our own stuff and hoping people will support us. And then it's not just the church, it's me. It's down to the personal level. And we'll talk more about that next week as well. So, beginning to tease out the idea that God is actually working on something. God, and whatever G-O-D refers to, and none of us actually knows, okay, it's like we don't have any other categories to compare what that means. But whatever this reality is that this depth dimension to life, this sacred other that we encounter in life, I tried to talk about it at the church this morning as the love that's pulsating at the heart of the universe. That's God. So as we get a sense that God is working on something. God is not, and even you think that we'll come to this point in just a moment, I guess, but even the fact that God apparently, and with this our language starts to break down on us, but God wasn't happy, is that word, just being God. In order for God to be God, God had to create this incredible universe, which we don't even know where the edges of it are. It's billions of years old. And supernovas and da-da-da-da-da. This is all part of God's being who God is, to create this amazing universe. And within the universe, at least in one place, and maybe in other places, to have creation actually self-aware, to have consciousness, like a plant or an animal or a pet, whatever, are alive, but they're not thinking about being alive. And this is part of, God didn't just want a kind of Legoland universe. He wanted a universe that could go wrong, but could also go fantastically well. So then the question becomes, what is it that God's on about, and what's our part in that? Which is kind of big picture thinking, I realise. So I've got 4 pictures here that might give a bit of might just be hooks to hang stuff off. And in a sense, I've been talking about this first one already. If we're trying to work out what God is on about, one of the first places to look is the universe. Because We're not saying God made it, as in God got out his little toolkit and started building stars and so on, okay. But we're saying this stuff exists because God, in some sense, called it out of nothing. It didn't have to be there. Scientists tell us there was a time when there was nothing. The universe did actually have a beginning moment. Now, this is not God of the gaps. One of the problems in theology has been, a few hundred years ago, God explained everything from the weather to whether you had a cold or not. It was all God. And that gave the church a really big job because we were like the official franchise for God stuff. But as scientists began to learn more and more stuff, we started to find natural explanations. And so we had this idea, but there's still things science can't explain. That's called the God of the gaps. And the trouble is, the God of the gaps is shrinking and shrinking because human knowledge is becoming more comprehensive. But the best science we have tells us that the universe is about 15 billion years old, which is a long time by our way of counting, and that there was, again, language breaks down, there was a time before which that universe didn't exist and a moment when it started to exist and has been continuing to unfold ever since that nano moment in the universe when nothingness became something. And that's the big miracle of faith, of being alive. So if we're trying to get a handle on what's God up to, then the universe gives us one very important point on direction. And it's a hell of a lot bigger. That's probably a bad phrase to use in this context, but it's awfully bigger, much, much bigger than whether or not you're being good this week and whether or not you're going to go to heaven or hell. For crying out loud. I mean, this is God's project, okay? And heaven and hell are nothing in amongst all that. Okay, so it's this something incredible.
What does that represent?
Oh, that's just one particular galaxy of which there are several. It's not the Milky Way because the Milky Way is a different shape. I don't know. I just grabbed a nice image of a sort of stellar, interstellar space. But that's one galaxy. It is so far away from us that no matter how fast a spaceship we build, we could never live long enough to get there. I mean, that's big. This is like bigger than driving to Lennox Head. Like, this is a really big place. And that's what God's on about. The scale of God's project is phenomenal. And we've often dumbed it down to, have you ticked off this list of rules this week or this month? And there's so much more to it. Why have I put that one up? What do you think I'm trying to tease out with this second image? Silence dominates the room. Okay, there is no trapdoor. I'm not going to kind of... Okay, so it's an icon. It happens to be a Greek Orthodox icon. It's an icon of Jesus, but I'm using it to say, from a Christian point of view, like everybody else alive, we can see this. But Christians also see this. They see Jesus. They go, there's something about that one individual human life which is, for us, is a kind of a window into the mystery of God. That for us, this is God showing us what God is like in human form. So it has to be one, it has to be specific, it has to be particular. He had to speak a particular language, had to be born at a particular place, particular point in time. He had to stub his toe on the rocks or get tired of an afternoon or whatever. So for Christians, and obviously it's different for Jewish people or Muslims or Hindus or whatever, but for Christians we're saying one of the ways we figure out what God is up to is because we pay attention to Jesus and we use him as our kind of code cracking device. When Napoleon, which was like 1799 or something thereabouts, went to Egypt, thought he'd capture the whole, basically thought he'd bump off the Ottoman Empire and take over the Middle East and stop the British getting the shipping route to India in the process. That's what the invasion of Egypt was all about. But he took along with him a whole lot of scientists and archaeologists and linguistic scholars, and happily they found the Rosetta Stone, which gave us the clue to crack hieroglyphics. Until then, for more than 2,000 years, nobody could crack the hieroglyphic code because they didn't have the Rosetta Stone, which gave the same bit of words, same bit of text in hieroglyphs and in Greek and in some other language. And once they had that, they could go, aha, this is how it was, like a Rubik's Cube. They started to crack the code. So Jesus is our Rosetta Stone for trying to make sense of this. Okay? And reminding us that it matters to be human. It doesn't mean that the rest of creation doesn't matter, but there is something really profoundly important about our part as humans in the scheme of things. I've got two other images to put up. What do you reckon they're going to be? Going to make you work a bit. Okay? What do you think? I know it's the coffee coming, but it's not for you. That's bad. Okay. So we've got the cosmos, we've got Jesus. There's going to be picture 3 and picture 4. What do you think might be about to appear on the screen? What kind of image? If you were writing this talk last night or Friday night, what other images would you have grasped? Robert, you're a teacher. People.
Got to bring it into the 20th century.
Right.
So you can something to bring it into this day and age.
For an old codger, he's pretty sharp, isn't he? No, he didn't know what I was doing. He's just a good thinking. He thinks ahead. Okay, so this is an image that captures sort of digital technology. Because everything we do with our iPhones and our computers and our iPads and so on, thank you for the coffee, by the way, very nice. It's all driven by a series of ones and zeros, which means nothing at all to me. That's not where my head works at all. Okay, but it's just a series of ones and zeros. Okay, which is basically yes, no, plus, negative. Okay, so we might think that has nothing to do with God and nothing to do with faith, nothing to do with the mission of the church. But I'm saying actually it does have, where we're going with our technology is profoundly important for what God is trying to achieve in the universe. And the part we might play in it or might fail to play in it if we mess it up, don't get it right. Now, I don't mean that God is a computer or God likes Windows or Apple or whatever. What I'm saying is this is taking us into a whole other domain of existence. Artificial reality, artificial intelligence, we're pushing boundaries and we are becoming creators. We're going somewhere where the universe has never been, as far as we know. The universe has not been before, at least not on this planet. Okay. One more box. So what I'm saying is that if we're going to try and understand what God is up to, what God's mission is, look at the universe, look at Jesus, look at the boundaries we're crossing in terms of digital technologies and artificial intelligence. Okay? What's the 4th box going to be while I have a sip of my coffee?
What about Mary?
Yeah. That's not going to be the box I'm going to put up, but why would you think of that one?
Well, without Mary, in human terms, do you think we've done pretty well?
Sure. So if you unpack this box, you might think about Mary and various other, including even the first group of people. This is like the Jesus box. This is the cosmos box. This is cutting-edge digital technology, artificial intelligence. Who knows what we're turning the world into, for good or ill. And I've got one other box that I wanted to put in the corner.
Have you got a Facebook Have you got a Facebook page?
No, well, I'm leaving that as sort of part of this. But yeah, but you're starting to get the. It could be. No suggestions. No, pass. Okay, what's that? Human DNA. Well, it's part of a DNA sequence. It may or may not be human, but the reason I've chosen it is we're not only, think about it, we're not only pushing out to the boundaries of the universe, we're not only creating virtual universes that didn't exist until we learned how to play with ones and zeros, but we're also coming to realise the incredibly intricate and connected realities of being alive, of being human. And 99, I love this quote, 99% of my, I can't speak for you, but 99% of my DNA is the same as the cockroach's DNA. What? How can this be? In other words, we're all connected. This web of life we talk about, it's not just connected at the macro level, which it's connected at the level of our DNA. We're all different, but actually we're far more alike, than we're different. But vive la différence. I mean, it's the difference that makes life interesting, of course. It's the variety, the richness. But the difference would be meaningless if there wasn't an underlying unity, if there wasn't some coherence. Imagine if, well, just at a really simple level, if we're too different, we can't breed. So we're individuals that live one life cycle and that's it. We can only reproduce and breed and replicate because there is a degree of compatibility and overlap and commonality. So if we're saying, well, what is God, where will we find some leads as to what God is trying to do in the world, or what is God trying to do, I would say, well, we've got to pay attention to the big project, which is the universe. As Christian people, we're going to be paying attention to what Jesus is, what Jesus is impacting, what difference Jesus makes. And maybe the difference he makes is not so much what he tells us as the way he invites us, how he asks us to look at the world, how he invites us to think about God. And if we start thinking about God the Jesus way, then a whole lot of other things might happen. Then there's this incredible creativity. As humans become creators and create virtual universes alongside the real universe, and one day they won't make that distinction. I'm dating myself as a 1952 model by even talking like that. Okay? And then, of course, there's the amazing capacity of our DNA sequencing and all that offers us in terms of genetic engineering, dealing with disease and so on, and all the ways that can go wrong and how it could be used to hurt people and control people and distort the universe. So when we think about that story, that legend, that fable of Adam and Eve and the talking snake, okay, it's one of those stories we'd say it's a true story even though it never happened, because each of these, there are Adam and Eve moments in here. There are Adam and Eve moments in DNA stuff. We can choose evil rather than good. And that's part of this whole picture. And this guy is helping us to look at life in such a way that we consistently choose good rather than repeatedly choose bad. Okay, so mission of God. It's about the whole universe. Jesus is at the centre of it for us because we're going to look at it, and Jesus is going to be our Rosetta Stone. It includes our digital technologies and the virtual worlds, and of course it reminds us of the incredible, intricate depth dimension to our DNA connectedness. And I'd want to say that all of these things, like the universe itself, remember that's always expanding, all of these things, and our faith is constantly open-ended and expanding. Christian faith is not something you get in a box and you put it under the bed and you keep it there and you bring it out in 45 years' time and it's exactly the same. Okay? It's always changing, always growing, which some churches forget about and don't seem to realise. So, within all of that, back a couple of decades ago now, the Anglican Consultative Council came up with this idea that there are 5 kind of attributes of mission that we need to be involved in as church. Proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, baptising, nurturing new believers, responding to human need by loving service, changing society's unjust structures, and safeguarding the integrity of creation, which is about the environment and climate change and global warming and all sorts of other things. Interestingly, there's nothing there about building lots of churches, raising lots of money, operating orphanages. I guess they might come under here, but we saw how badly that worked out with the way we treated people in care. Okay. Most of the things we think of at church tend not to be headlined in this list. They're kind of top levels. Let's just briefly work through each of them, keeping an eye on our time. So the first one is proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. That's in red. I've got the actual text, so we don't just get the summary. So this is, I guess, saying to us, there's some stuff we know and some stuff we believe that really matters to us. And one of the most important, one of the first marks of mission is that we're sharing that stuff that we know. Now, we've used religious language. We've called it the good news. We've called it the kingdom. The irony is the word good news or gospel, that word is actually, back when they started using that word, it was an everyday government term. The euangelion, which is the Greek word that we translate as good news, the euangelion was when the emperor sent someone out onto the street to make an announcement. It was like the government gazette being published. Okay? But now we've made it a religious word, and so it kind of loses its edginess. So we've got some news to share, and the news that we're sharing is to do with the kingdom. Well, that's of course shorthand. We mean God being in charge. We don't mean that there's a bit of dirt somewhere that's God's kingdom. That will be the Clarence Valley, I suppose, or maybe the Richmond Valley if I'm a Lismore boy, okay? We don't mean that. What we mean is, and again, the word has got lost in translation, as they say. It's not actually kingdom. It would be better to translate it as kingship or reign. Talking about God's reign, in other words, God being actively involved. And if we believe God is actively involved in the world, well, that gives us some good news to share. So that's what I was just rabbiting on about. Kingdom / empire / reign of God. The good news, in other words, we've got something worth knowing and sharing, we believe, otherwise we wouldn't be Christian. And so part of this is that, and Anglicans are not good at this, that we know what we believe and we share it. I don't mean we become religious pests, constantly bombarding our school friends and our relatives. I have an aunt who, for many, many decades in her life, she's now too old to do it, I think, or she's just given up. But she was constantly writing me letters telling me where my theology was wrong, which may be correct, but constantly wanting to correct, not just me, everybody in the family. You might have one. You've got one of those in your family. Okay. They're the religious nutters. And they give religion a bad name, so the rest of us sort of go, well, I go to church, but I'm not really religious or something. Okay? So I don't mean like that. But if we really think we're onto something here that God has revealed to us through other people and so on, then we need to know what it is, understand it, be willing to share it. And the last couple of words actually come supposedly from St. Francis of Assisi, who famously said, preach the gospel unceasingly, use words if necessary. Okay? There are too many people who think words will get you there. Actually, it's the quality, it's the integrity of our life. And words will occasionally be necessary. So it's not just about using words, but we shouldn't be afraid to use words if we want to, if we need to. remember years ago I was working at the Education Faculty at Griffith University, and I was in charge of the academic admin section. And there was a never-ending war between student admin and academic admin within the Faculty of Education. And I was in charge of the academic admin team. And eventually one of the folk came around and said, I don't get it. You're different from the other people. You're not involved in this constant hostility. And so I had to use some words. I said, well, I guess it's because, end of the day, there are bigger things going on in my life than any kind of buzz I get out of knifing somebody else at work. That's not it for me. I'm a Christian and I get my satisfaction from other things, not from stopping you getting a promotion or getting a bit more money for the... So I had to use words in the end, but they had picked up a difference. I said, I am actually a priest, of course, I'm just working at the uni for a while. Okay, second one is nurturing new believers, or technically, to teach, baptise and nurture new believers. So sure, if we're going to be church, then we have to be, one of our big jobs is to make sure the people who are in the church know what we believe, know how to practice their faith, and are confident in their faith. Otherwise, they can't do the previous one. They'll have nothing to share. So there's a couple of ideas come out of that. We should expect, if we're taking this seriously, that from time to time, hopefully all the time, but from time to time, other people will be coming along and joining us and saying, I want to be part of this thing. I want to be part of the church. They won't necessarily use lots of religious language. They might just say something like, I really feel, I like what I feel when I come into the cathedral and I want to be part of what happens here. Now, that's not technically very religious language, but they're beginning to say, I can sense something is here and I want to be part of it. And then we have to unpack that. So we should expect new believers to be joining us. That does not mean that we should be running around town trying to steal people from the other churches or from other religions. It's saying when someone comes along and says, I feel drawn to be part of your group, we make them welcome, we teach them what it's about. But we don't ever give the idea that we're the only ones that have the truth. Now I know there are some other Anglican priests not far away from here who would have a different point of view, but I think it's important that we realise that God is at work in more places than just the Christian church. So what are we going to be doing? If you look at the list, it was to teach, to baptise and to nurture. So giving people information. Baptising means we're using ritual, we're using sacraments, and all of that together means we're going to be nurturing them in their faith. And that's partly what we're doing at the moment for Laura and Julia and the other kids that are doing their first communion, some of the other older ones that are doing their confirmation preparation. We're trying to give you a sense of, what's this about? So you can kind of plug into it at your own level. It's also what our Building Strong Families program was about, because in broad terms we baptise, say, 40 babies a year. That's nice. It might be nice if it was 80 babies a year, but we baptise that's basically 40 mums and 40 families, 40 sets of mums and dads who say, there's something about having a baby that makes me think about God. So we baptise the baby. And what have we done for the last few years? Nothing. So now we're going to try and make sure that we actually travel with that family and help them to work out what it means to be Christian mums and dads. Responding to human need by loving service. This is something we have done really well, as in the church has done really well. But we also know from the Royal Commission how badly it can go wrong. I mean, the kids were in children's homes because the church was running children's homes because there were kids that needed care. What we didn't do properly was to listen to the kids when they said, that person over there is hurting me. We didn't listen, we didn't pay attention. So compassionate action for the good of other people is just a core part of being Christian. And often it's a really good way to start a conversation even without words. Why have you come? I mean, it's a risk because it's what's called rice bowl evangelism. If you go to a poor country and you offer them food, they might come to your church to get the food. But are they? You can see the risk straight away. We want them to realise that whether they choose to become Christians or not, we care about them, and we're not trying to switch them over to our team. We're simply saying, you're doing it tough. We've got a bit of spare at the moment. We can help out in some way. So compassionate action for the common good is really important. In emergency situations, that means aid, going in with plane loads of food or clean water or whatever. But in between times, it means development. And groups like the Christmas Bowl and other Christian aid organisations, World Vision and so on. Yes, they're there when there's an emergency, but most importantly, they're there between the emergencies trying to get clean water, improve the education services for the village and so on, to try to lift the capacity in between emergencies. And of course, sometimes we have to stand up and say, no, get the children off Nauru, or stop this policy. It's hurting people, whether that be people that need assistance inside our country or people overseas. So aid, most people have no trouble giving a bit of help when someone runs into a hard time. Helping develop things so they can look after themselves, and again, people generally support that. When you begin to get involved in advocacy, calling on the government to change its policies, then we start to get political. And then people go, oh, religion and politics don't mix. But of course, they mix all the time. And if any church knows that, it should be the Anglican Church. We've been mixed up with politics at least since the time of Henry VIII and long before. This then leads us into this fourth one, which was transforming an unjust society, or to put it in their proper words, this gets big, heavy language, to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind, and to pursue peace and reconciliation. Perhaps the best example of that is the change that happened in South Africa through the anti-apartheid program, and then eventually with people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu heading up the Justice and Reconciliation Commission. But I remember when having a point of view about South Africa was very controversial. They're all communists, there's ANC, they're communists, they're trying to take over the world. They weren't communists, they were Africans trying to get a little bit of control over their own future. But it was very controversial at the time, yeah.
Just on the it's interesting that sport played a very strong role.
Absolutely. And remember how controversial it was to have a ban on cricket. I mean, it was one of my first political moments was actually the Springbok tour. And in Queensland, Bajoki Peters wouldn't allow anybody to demonstrate. Declared a state of emergency. It was just a couple of street blocks. So he got special powers and so on. Because the significance of allowing the white fellas to come and play football was more important, apparently, than the justice for the black fellas. And now we look back and say, how did we get that so wrong? I mean, but it was such a visceral issue at the time. So this is where the church starts to get, and we've just seen Sister Pat, I can't think of her last name, Rose or something, being expelled from the Philippines, been there 30 years, 40 years, doing exactly this kind of stuff, helping as part of the Catholic Church in the Philippines, helping the Filipinos to fight corruption and all the rest. So she's been sent home, thank you very much. We don't need troublesome Christians like you in the country, even though it's a Christian country. And the government would say they're all good Catholics and all the rest, but, this is where remember the first couple of generations of Christians were being murdered and persecuted by the Roman Empire. Okay, it wasn't politically acceptable. So actually, politics and religion do mix, and even just call Jesus Lord Jesus Christ is to make a political claim. Again, we've forgotten, but 2,000 years ago, there was one Lord in town. He was the emperor. That was his title, Domine. He was Lord. He was also called God, and he was also called Saviour. Okay, so Domitian, the emperor, for instance, insisted that people had to address him as my Lord and my God. These were political labels, like we say Your Excellency or whatever. You know, it was the divine Domitian, and you addressed him as Lord, you addressed him as Saviour. Okay, so when Christians started saying Jesus is the Lord, they were saying not the emperor. That's treason. When they said Jesus is the Saviour, they were saying, no, God is not blessing you through the emperor. God is going to bless you through Jesus. Okay, and so on. So, Lord, God, Saviour, and so on. These were political terms which were used by the early Christians, and then we made them spiritual terms. But in fact, they're very interrelated. So at times we will seek to change the structures of society. Now, we do that in a culture which is very democratic and open. Doesn't mean we won't get our heads kicked in, okay, as part of the robust exchange of views. But we have a much better place to do it than some countries like the Philippines or Uganda or wherever, or China. We're going to challenge violence. Well, it's not just gun violence, which, by the way, in America, of course, is big controversy, the power of the gun lobby, but we're talking about domestic violence. We're talking about violence against people of different genders. We're talking about violence against gay and lesbian people, transgender people, and so on, as well as the obvious violence against people because they look different or they eat different food or whatever. So challenge violence of every kind is part of the job description of an Anglican church, according to the 5 marks of mission. And pursuing peace and reconciliation doesn't mean you don't take sides. I mean, if someone's being beaten up by a big bully, you've got to take sides and stand with the victim. But hopefully you don't get involved in counter-violence. So part of the trick is, how do we do this? How do we work for peace and reconciliation without getting involved in violence? And look back, that's what the debate was in South Africa in the 1970s. The World Council of Churches program to combat racism was widely condemned amongst Australian churches as giving money for the communists to buy guns because they were funding the African National Congress. As you can see, this is tricky stuff you're going to get. But if it's worth doing, it's probably worth being tricky, complicated. And then the integrity of creation, which has become more controversial in some parts of the world recently. Remember, this was written like 25 years ago. Strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. So I was saying in church this morning, this world matters. So Christians should be passionate about the environment and looking after the integrity of God's world. We should be embracing, not promoting climate change, but engaging with climate change, not this Mickey Mouse creation science stuff, which is saying, oh, God made it all in 6 days and He'll just remake it again when He's ready. If you're living on Tuvalu or any of the other Pacific Island states, it's not any help to have someone saying God's looking after you. Their islands are disappearing under the ocean. And it's going to happen not just to the Pacific Island states. There'll be millions of people in Bangladesh and millions of people in China, in the big river valleys, whose land will simply go underwater in the next few decades. Are we still going to determine who comes into our country? There are going to be millions of people made refugees simply because of the rising seawater. It's going to be your guys' problems, isn't it? Most of us won't be having to worry about it, but it's a huge issue.
We're in good hands.
We feel safe. So, and again, there are certain kinds of Christianity that, it doesn't matter, the world's going to end. Well, They were when I was finishing high school, and when they were telling me that Billy Graham said Jesus will be coming back within 10 years. Well, guys, I finished high school 50 years ago, and he hasn't come back. And that story has been told for how long? Okay, we've got to take seriously looking after God's world. It doesn't mean we never cut down a tree, but I mean we've got to take seriously looking after the environment. And as I was talking about in the sermon a little bit this morning, we're not looking for another world anytime soon, and even if we could, and there isn't one to go to, but we can't build that many spaceships to take 4 billion people to another planet. Okay? There is no plan B. It's this earth. That's where God has put us. That's where we have to flourish. So, these things we've been talking about, if you like, are the core business of the church. For me as an individual, for us together, these are what we're on about. These things matter. Sharing our faith, nurturing disciples, being there for people in need, standing up when something's wrong, looking after the world. These 5 things are part of who we are because of our baptism. God calls us into being intentional participants in what God is doing in the world. And it's all of those things we were talking about earlier. So we're not looking to have a little book that gives us all the answers from 2,000 years ago. It doesn't exist. And besides that, what about all the humans that lived in the 285,000 years before 2,000 years ago? I mean, I can take you to Mount Carmel in the north of Israel, just behind Haifa. There are caves there from Neolithic times where humans were living there, having babies, raising their families, cooking their meals, following their crafts, 285,000 BC. Was God absent from their life? Surely not. So we've got to have an attitude that says it's not about a closed set of ancient answers. It's more about the journey than it's about the destination. It's how we're travelling that makes a difference, where our faith makes a difference, not so much the destination. Now that is when the bishop confirms people, and also when we baptise people in the church service, these are the words that are used in the blessing at the end. I'm not sure that that's actually what Murray looks like, but he might look like that in a couple of years' time as the weight of looking after Grafton weighs upon him. Listen to these words. This is what the bishop says, or the priest says, at the end of a baptism service, end of a confirmation service. Go forth into the world in peace. Get out there. Yeah? Go and get involved in the world. Don't sit around church all day. Be of good courage. Be gutsy. Be brave. Hold fast what is good. Okay? That's a really important line, actually. Know what is good and stick to it. In other words, follow your conscience. Render to no one evil for evil. Don't pay back. Someone kicks you in the guts, don't kick them in the guts. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the afflicted. Give honour to all. Love and serve the Lord, rejoicing in the power of the Holy Spirit. We've been saying that to people at the end of baptism services, at the end of confirmation services for years. Okay? But we haven't done a very good job, I guess, of helping people implement it. That's the job as Christians. We come to church in a sense to get encouraged in our faith so that we can leave church and go and do it somewhere else during the rest of the week, whether that's working in the op shop or whatever it is we do. Okay? It's going out and making a difference somewhere else. That's what the faith is all about. Okay, so we'll leave it there.